Xbox now owns Activision Blizzard King. Let's talk about what that means for Xbox Game Pass and for Xbox backwards compatibility. Be sure to like the video, subscribing is great as well. So we're going to be diving into what exactly to expect when all of these games do come to the service, which will probably be one big update, with some small trickling out things due to license agreements and other little elements that come into play. So first off, we are expecting all of this content to arrive in 2024. It is a little bit disappointing that they weren't able to get anything out in 2023 as part of this deal, but I guess there was a lot of confusion as to whether or not it was going to get through. So all of this content should drop at some point in 2024, hopefully, which I'm guessing more towards the earlier part of the year, again bearing any sort of legality or any sort of licensing agreement that might be in play. So first up, the easiest thing to start with is the Call of Duty franchise. So day one, everything should be available, aside from maybe one or two titles, and we're going to get to that. The larger question, however, is the missing backwards compatible titles. So Call of Duty basically is entirely available to play on Xbox, the whole legacy of it, except for Call of Duty Finest Hour, Call of Duty 2, the big red one, and also Call of Duty Classic. So those three titles are missing, and we don't know if it has to do with technical problems, whether or not Activision didn't want to make them available. Those ones are kind of a big iffy thing. If they were to become backwards compatible now, that would mean that they did work through whatever licensing was the problem. If they don't, it means it was very likely technical issues that were limiting these titles from becoming available on the modern Xbox platform, which would be really disappointing. If those were to come back as backwards compatible titles that you could buy, they would definitely also be on Game Pass. So for Call of Duty games, it really is a ranking order. Essentially, anything I would say up till Modern Warfare 3.2 this last year should be available on Game Pass day one as soon as that order is complete, barring the one option of Cold War, because that one was on PS Plus, which usually creates some sort of agreement between PlayStation and said company, where there might be a lock of, like, say, a year on that one, or 6 months, or something like that, depending on the agreement that was made, in order to make that one available on PS Plus. So there would be some kind of limiting factor there. They have also mentioned already that Modern Warfare 3.2 will come to Game Pass in 2024. We don't know if that will be earlier or if that will be after a year, again, due to the agreement that PlayStation has had for the marketing rights for Call of Duty. So everything else should be good to go. Call of Duty 2, Call of Duty 3, Call of Duty 4, Call of Duty 4 Remastered, Call of Duty World at War, Modern Warfare 2, Modern Warfare 2.2, Modern Warfare 3, Modern Warfare 3.2 eventually, Ghosts, Infinite Warfare, Advanced Warfare. Sorry, there's so many Call of Duty games. Did I get the ball? That's almost all of them, right? Oh, Black Ops. Do we do 2, 3, 4? And then Cold War is the one that's kind of a straggling issue. But yeah, all those should be good to go. The big question, really, I would say, for Call of Duty at this point, though, is whether or not those three missing legacy titles will become available. And I'm kind of hoping they are, because obviously they're pretty cool games. The whole Call of Duty franchise is really interesting. I would say the only licensing thing would likely be the historical footage that some of those older ones use. Might be the big holdup. Next up is Cabela's. So yeah, Activision had a bunch of Cabela games, like a good dozen of them. Some of them are backwards compatible only via the disc. You're not able to buy them. If they could work out a licensing with Cabela, I don't see why these games wouldn't be available and why they wouldn't be available via Game Pass. But yeah, it really comes down to Xbox basically talking to Cabela's and making a deal with them, or whoever has the overall ownership there. It's kind of a weird situation, but one that could actually get itself worked out. The next one is Crash Bandicoot. So all of the modern titles, day one, easily Crash Bandicoot 4, Crash Team Rumble, Crash Nitro Racing. The question would be some of the older historical titles, whether or not those will now become backwards compatible, whereas they weren't before, because there's a few stragglers here or there. But yeah, pretty much everything Crash Bandicoot that is available for sale right now will become available on day one Game Pass for Activision. Whenever the first day of the Activision drop is, you will find Crash Bandicoot there, running along and going, whoa! Yep, Crash Bandicoot will be ready to go. Diablo. Another very easy one, Diablo 2 Resurrected, Diablo 3, and Diablo 4. Now, Diablo 2 Resurrected and Diablo 3 should be available day one, available through that Activision deal via Game Pass. The question is for 4, they have noted that Diablo 4 will come to Game Pass in 2024. We don't know if there's any sort of weird agreement where they're not going to drop that right away, but Xbox does have the marketing rights, so there really isn't reason at all as to why that wouldn't be available on Game Pass, unless there's some sort of weird agreement with other platform holders that would, kind of prevent that, but I don't believe there is. So I believe the entire Diablo series will be available on the first day that they do the big Game Pass drop. Which moves us on to the next one, Geometry Wars. Yep, all of it will be available via Game Pass. Geometry Wars 2 and 3 should be available, I believe, right away. I don't know if I don't know if that one's still for sale, but yeah, anything that's sold for Geometry Wars will be available day one. Gun is an iffy one because they haven't made that backwards compatible. And I don't know what the limiting factor would be as to why Gun isn't backwards compatible, but there's an original Xbox version, there is a 360 version of Gun. I would imagine that if they can make that backwards compatible, then it will also be available on Game Pass, which would be kind of an interesting Western. Guitar Hero. No, that will not be available via Game Pass, it will not be available via backwards compatibility. First of all, the licensing would be a nightmare. Second of all, we don't have support for the peripherals, so the Guitar Hero games are not backwards compatible. If they did, for whatever reason, want to make these available, they would have to solve the licensing for all the songs, they'd have to solve the peripheral compatibility or release a new guitar. The Guitar Hero games just are not going to be made available, and they're definitely not going to be made available via Game Pass unless they get that all sorted out, and I just can't see that happening. So for me, Guitar Hero is a definite no. Which brings us to James Bond 007. Dun-dun-dun-dun. Now this one is really interesting because Activision did release a number of James Bond games. Tie-ins, standalone things. It's a good question. Now obviously Xbox has worked out the copyright or the trademark or whatever it is needed for a GoldenEye, the classic GoldenEye, to be available. So with Activision, they did make a GoldenEye remake. They did make Bloodstone, I think it's Bloodstone, Quantum of Solace. They made just these like tie-in Bond games, which, hit or miss. Legends is another one. So there's a few there, and I would assume if they have the licensing worked out for, the original GoldenEye, theoretically, they might have also worked out the licensing for these other James Bond games. The other question would be the likeness of Daniel Craig, which appears across the different games, and the multiplayer being shuttered, but you could still enjoy the single-player stuff. So I would imagine if they do bring back the James Bond stuff, it would be about 50-50 if it's available on Game Pass, just due to licensing agreements, but I could see them maybe just literally making it available via the disc, if anything. And, of course, there could be technical issues, but yeah, that one is a big iffy for me, because I see the fact that they have GoldenEye done. So technically, GoldenEye remake, which, has even less weird ownership on that one, should be a yes if they want to make it available. So I would actually lean more towards the fact that I think, decently confidently, that GoldenEye at least, or a number of the James Bond games, will become available, at least through backwards compatibility, if not also through Game Pass. But just want to give my kind of clear sort of wavering on that one. I think it is actually quite possible. King's Quest, absolutely yes. The King's Quest, I believe, is 2016 episodic series, day one on Game Pass. Great series, definitely recommend checking it out when it does drop. Marvel. So Marvel is very complicated, but also not super complicated. So for this one, it really comes down to Disney. So Disney has the rights to all of the Fox content, because Activision made X-Men games, quite a few of them. They made Spider-Man games. They made Deadpool and quite a few other miscellaneous Marvel Ultimate Alliance, stuff like that. It would really come down to Disney. Well, firstly, technical issues, if there are some preventing backwards compatibility. But the other thing is Disney saying yes or no. Now, there are issues with, perhaps, depending on how everything was set up, the likeness of some characters. So there's a lot of Marvel titles, so it's hard to break down every single one of them. But something like, say, the X-Men games where they use the likeness of certain individuals or the voices, or say the original Spider-Man games, Spider-Man 1, 2, and 3 with Tobey Maguire. They use the likeness, the voice work, and other elements from those particular actors, which may or may not change how the licensing is handled on those titles. But things like The Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2, Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, Spider-Man Edge of Time, Spider-Man Web of Shadows, stuff like that would really come down to literally just Disney saying yes or no. Now you may wonder about the Sony element of it. Sony owns the rights to the movie Spider-Man over, I believe it's an hour in length, so they own the film rights. They could have some impact in regards to the original Spider-Man games 1, 2, and 3, but other stuff where the properties are basically original Spider-Man, it really comes down to whether or not an agreement can be worked out with Disney in regards to making those games available. Will they be available via Game Pass? There's some things that say, yeah, Disney might be open to it, whereas there's other things where Disney likes making money, so it might come down to basically Microsoft being like, hey, you guys can make the money on this, as there is rules and rights due to publishing and everything like that on whether or not these become available. So this one really is up in the air, and I think it's even more divided up in the air in regards to like what parts of Marvel you get. I think some of those original Spider-Man games are a little bit more likely than others, or maybe they'll save them for remastering, who knows. And then things like the X-Men ones, a little less likely, original Spider-Man, a little less likely. Stuff that ties in is even more difficult. And I think the most likely situation is that some of these become backwards compatible for the first time. Maybe if we're lucky, some of them on Game Pass, if Xbox really works out a great deal there. And then some of them are just going to continue to be lost because, like most licensed IP, it is a bit of a nightmare to sort that stuff all out, and that's where it's very hard for me to give you a blanket Marvel response, because we have no idea where that's going to land, just because there's so many separate properties that have so many little bits attached to them, and they never foresaw this sort of thing. Overwatch 2. So obviously Overwatch 1 is gone, Overwatch 2 is available, you already get some Game Pass perks. I would imagine they'll continue with like hero perks if you have Game Pass. Other than that, it'll be about the same. It's a free-to-play game, so it doesn't really impact things too much in that regard. Next up is Prototype. Prototype 1 and 2 are remastered, but not really remastered. They're just ported over. Day 1, Game Pass, easy and done, no questions asked, absolutely. Sekiro. Now, this one was a bit weird. So obviously, Activision published Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, so it'd be a little bit up in the air depending on how the publishing agreement was done. The fact that Xbox included that within their big trailer of we bought Activision Blizzard, I am pretty confidently saying yes, that'll be available on Game Pass Day 1. And now we have the Tony Hawk series, which is another one that is a bit of a nightmare. So Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1+2, the remake, I say yes, Day 1 Game Pass on that one. The other ones, most of them are not backwards compatible, and it's due to like licensing. Music licensing, character licensing, and then getting on those on Game Pass. Like, if they work out the licensing for the music and the characters, you know, the different, I guess you would say, performers and or skateboarders, athletes, whatever you want to say, yes, they could put those on Game Pass. It would be very likely they would if they go through the trouble of making the backwards compatible. Maybe they'll just make the discs available. That one is really hard, and then there's also technical issues. So I would say that for Tony Hawk, that's really, really up in the air. I'm very confident about the 1+2, because that is so recent and much more, like, doable, but the other ones, it's a lot more questionable, because the cost of the music and licensing for that sounds like a bit of a nightmare. Transformers. Activision actually made, like, the best Transformers games. Fall of Cybertron, War for Cybertron, incredible. There was also not so good ones. There was, Rise of the Dark Spark, which was horrific, and some other ones, like there was Devastation was kind of neat, and there was quite a few Transformers games. There's a Dark of the Moon tie-in, Revenge of the Fallen, all that kind of stuff. I think Revenge of the Fallen was Activision. Dark of the Moon was. So those ones, I would say yes, actually, to Game Pass. Very, very likely. So War for Cybertron, Fall of Cybertron, definitely. Hasbro has said and expressed that they want that available via Game Pass. They want those games available. I hope they remaster them, but it sounds like Activision is basically having the go-ahead, same with Microsoft, they're one company now, from Hasbro saying, yes, we want these available on Game Pass. It's just them working out a deal. Now, there are some elements where there could be a bit of an issue, and that would be the movie tie-ins, where they've got the use of the Chevrolet vehicles. That would come down to making a deal with the, well, actually not just Chevrolet, other car manufacturers. You would have to go and chat about the licensing there, possibly also doing some sort of dealing with like Paramount, because obviously they're movie tie-ins. So the movie tie-in ones, a little bit more awkward, but the original things like Devastation, War for Cybertron, Fall of Cybertron, Rise of the Dark Spark, that stuff, yes, should be on Game Pass, should be made available via backwards compatibility again. So the next one is True Crime, which I believe is kind of an IP that has been left alone or kind of just thrown to the side. You would have to work out some licensing there, but should Xbox be interested in True Crime, I don't see any reason why those wouldn't be available unless there was some sort of technical issue making those not playable on the Xbox side of things. But yes, I would actually say that True Crime games, if there is still an element of ownership, yes, this would be available backwards compatible wise, and yes, they would also make them available via Game Pass. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, that one is similar to, not necessarily Transformers, but that one, they've done numerous TMNT games. It would come down to making some sort of agreement with, I guess you would say, Nickelodeon, and then also if there's any sort of movie tie-in type stuff, possibly Paramount, and that one really is kind of iffy to me. I'm leaning towards no for the Turtles games, but again, it would really come down to Xbox working and doing some sort of licensing agreement with the ownership of those companies to make them available, as long as there were no technical issues. Return to Castle Wolfenstein. So this one, at least console-wise, for the original Xbox, was published by Activision. So Xbox owns Bethesda, Xbox owns Activision. I don't see why this couldn't become backwards compatible, unless again there is a technical issue preventing that. If it is backwards compatible, it will be available via Game Pass. Same with Wolfenstein 2009, and also Enemy Territory. I would imagine those ones would also kind of be cleared up, because again, it's a whole, they own Bethesda, they own Activision. Totally good on all sides. And finally, also Quake 4 would fall under that same banner. As I said, though, there could be some sort of thing where maybe they're getting remastered, maybe there's some technical issues. Who knows in that regard? But yeah, that should be pretty good to go. We do also have a bit more of a fun one, Singularity. I would say probably there's a music licensing thing, so that one actually should very likely, yes, be available via backwards compatibility and Game Pass once this deal is done, unless there is a technical issue preventing that. But the really fun one is Shrek. So Shrek, as long as they get the agreements from the owners, DreamWorks and their parent company, I could see the Shrek games becoming backwards compatible and available via Game Pass, if that was something they wanted to sort out licensing wise. A lot of the Activision properties were licensed. Most of them were. Yes, they've created original things like Call of Duty, and they own Crash Bandicoot and Spyro. So Spyro will be on Game Pass day one. All of the Spyro titles that are available, Spyro Reignited, and possibly some of the previous historical elements as well from the Spyro franchise could become available again, and that includes the likes of, say, Skylanders. Those games I think they will sort out, but the big issue is whether or not there's certain components with some of them in regards to characters, because it's a toys to game experience, so that would have to be kind of worked out, or kind of the ones that don't rely on that I think should work fine, and those would also be available via Game Pass, because they do fully own those ones, outside of maybe some licensed characters they include. But yeah, that should be good to go. I'm just kind of double checking my list to make sure I went through every single thing. There's a lot of dense stuff in this one. But yeah, okay, there we go. We've covered the full listing of all of the titles. I hope you found this helpful. And yes, it really does come down to a little bit of, I don't know, speculation to some degree, but I can kind of break them down to what makes sense. Firstly, is there a technical issue preventing this? Secondly, can they work out the licensing? Thirdly, is it costing too much to throw it on Game Pass? Is the value there? There's a lot of details on a lot of things, and there's a lot of companies that own a lot of different licensed stuff, because like I said, Activision, Blizzard King, a lot of the stuff under that roof was licensed properties, whether that's Marvel, Transformers, Turtles. That kind of what helped them build up such an empire was basically using these different properties, leveraging them, and allowing themselves to grow. So it should be really interesting to see how this all gets worked out, and James Bond too. And I think this kind of really broke things down well, went over all the context, and I hope the most games we can have possible are available because gaming is great and preserving these titles is excellent.